You've been cordially invited to another episode of I'll Tell You What, the podcast that's all love, Black history. I'll Tell You What is presented by Hueido, and I'm Ashley, your favorite raconteuse that tells you these love stories every single Monday. So don't forget to subscribe on the Tube of You or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, don't forget to follow, share, review, and join us on the Triana Pay so you can help me pick the next love stories you'll be seeing very soon. And if you want to reach me for any reason, head to I'llTellYouWhat.com. So let me take you to a place. In the heart of the city's pulsating rhythm, a haven emerges, where the night comes alive in a symphony of lights and beats. This clandestine sanctuary, draped in the velvet allure of darkness, beckons seekers of euphoria and escape. Now, this venue can become anything you want it to be: an opening of opportunity, a cavity of community, or an environment of excitement. For those that are lucky, this can also be the location to love. From early periods in history like the Harlem Renaissance to even today, I'll tell you how this place of nightlife has been all of these things and more. Soon, I'll tell you about some of the legends that indeed found love in the club. And I'll also tell you about the love story of one particular entertainer that found notoriety in nightlife, while also struggling to find peace and love within herself. And that is Gladys Bentley. There are so many Black celebrities throughout time that have found love in the club. Let's go back to even the early 1900s to, of course, more recently. Now, thinking about this from a 2024 perspective, it makes sense. A Stanford study published in 2019 showed that in 2017, about 27% of couples met at a bar. Especially in the advent of online dating, meeting at a bar, club, or restaurant isn't that uncommon. But back then, the club could provide a setting of distraction and vibes. Through the Harlem Renaissance and even into Prohibition, we saw a thriving nightlife, but that also included vaudeville venues, ballrooms, speakeasies, rent parties, and buffet flats. These functions from the past were not just places where Black people met in unison, but also white people would find their way to the Black side of town because, of course, our appeal is alluring. But because the club was a place where you could see and meet a variety of people, this is where a lot of these relationships began. Like these, for instance. This one example is from 1919. That's when blues singer Ethel Waters met a dancer named Ethel Williams at the Harlem Alhambra. They worked together. As historian Dr. Cookie Woolner wrote, quote, "Unbeknownst to many of her fans, the talented dancer who accompanied Waters on tour and performed a dance number to warm up the crowd before the singer appeared was her girlfriend. Sometime before they started to date or while dating, Ethel Waters asked her boss to give the other Ethel a job and to help with the compensation, take $10 out of her $35 a week pay, in addition to paying the other Ethel another $10. To the majority of people at that time, they didn't see the two Ethels as a couple, but as colleagues and friends. Dr. Woolner also wrote, quote, "They were able to tour together without raising suspicion over the status of their relationship, since their different art forms fit in with the popular style of entertainment at the time. They dated until sometime in the 1920s, when Ethel Waters allegedly left her for a man named Clyde Edwards Matthews." Now, another example was in the early 1950s, when Eartha Kitt met a, quote, "Belgian steel manufacturer with a lot of money, Michel de Merbe or Merbes or Merbe, I apologize with the pronunciation. But anywho, they met at a nightclub in Madrid. According to Jet magazine, when he first laid eyes on her as she was walking around, quote, he rose from his seat and said aloud, "Who is she? I must meet that woman." They dated for about 2 years or so, when around 1952, the news began to come out that they were engaged. However, nothing more came from their relationship. Entertainer Sammy Davis Jr. met his second wife, a Swedish actress named Britt, in 1959 in the club. She was there attending a party that Sammy was throwing for his friend, jazz singer Dinah Washington. They got married by the end of 1960, which was a very controversial move because, as you know, interracial marriage wasn't legal in all states yet. And, you know, the situation around his first marriage. But anyway. Also, actress and singer Leslie Uggams met her husband, an Australian man named Graham Pratt, around 1964 when she was 21. She was there performing at a club in Sydney when they met. And she said after that night, quote, "My mother and I saw plenty of Graham. I found myself really falling for him." And they had a very short engagement of about 5 months and got married in 1965. And actually next year, they're going to celebrate 60 years of marriage. Now, in the late 1960s, a young Pam Grier made her way to Los Angeles from Colorado. A few of her friends made her come out with them one night. She didn't have a lot of money for clothes or makeup or anything, so she just wore her outfit from work to the club. There, she met a very tall guy of 7 feet and 2 inches that, quote, as long and lanky as he was, Pam wrote that, quote, he had great rhythm and he knew all the moves. Soon, he came up to her and asked her to dance. That guy was Lou Alcindor, a UCLA basketball star that would soon go to play for the Milwaukee Bucks. But you probably know of him as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. They broke up after he converted to Islam because she would not convert. Now, also in the 1960s, granted they met at a bowling alley, Bill Cosby took his then girl he was trying to date, Camille, on a first date to the comedy club he was performing in. So technically, yes, he brought a date to work, but it would be the start of their relationship that would hit 60 years of marriage just about a week ago. And in the late 1960s, a Wisconsin couple, Manonia Evans and Donna Burkett, met in a gay club. Now, when they were denied a marriage license, they filed a federal lawsuit. It was dismissed, however, over, quote, technical legal issues, but that did not stop them as they moved forward with their wedding plans and invited 250 guests to watch them get married in Milwaukee on Christmas of 1971. And during the mid-1970s, Grammy winner Natalie Cole met a keyboard player named Kevin Nance in a club for an event to honor Van McCoy, the singer and arranger behind the song The Hustle, you know, Do the Hustle. So they met in July, were exclusive by September, and then he proposed and they were to be married on August 1st of 1976. And sometime in that window, he also joined her band. But just weeks before their nuptials, Jet magazine reported that they had called off their engagement. And for the jazz musician Louis Armstrong, and yes, Louis, not Louis, and if you don't know why I'm saying that, go back and look it up. He met all 4 of his wives, and even the mother of his only child, allegedly, in the club. His first wife, Daisy, was a sex worker that he met in the late 1910s. He was playing at a club called the Brick House in Gretna, Louisiana. They married in 1918 and were officially divorced by December 23rd, 1923. Now, his second wife was a musician too, named Lil Hardin. They met at the Dreamland Cafe in 1922 and began to work together. They eventually started to date, and 6 weeks after his divorce to Daisy was finalized, on February 5th, 1924, they got married in Chicago. But in early 1925, he met the woman who would become his third wife, a lady named Alpha. Now, she would show up at the Vendome where he worked and sit on the front row, I guess, to capture his attention, which worked. They then began a relationship while he was still married to Lil. And Louis and Lil didn't divorce until 1938, but he would go on to marry Alpha 2 weeks later. And of course, that was around the time he met his fourth wife, Lucille. Now, they met while he worked at the Cotton Club, and Lucille was one of the chorus girls there. Lewis would divorce Alpha in September 1942, and 5 days later, marry Lucille. Now, while he was married to Lucille, he allegedly had an affair with another dancer from the Cotton Club, also named Lucille. Now, that entanglement produced a daughter named Sharon. They were secretly together for over 10 years, but eventually broke up due to him still being married and not leaving his wife like he said he would. And let's fast forward it some. I mean, even a teenage Paula Patton met a teenage Robin Thicke at a teen club in the early 1990s. And former quarterback Michael Vick met his wife Kiafa in the club in 2002 after his first season with the Falcons rep. Not only was the club a place that you could possibly meet the love of your life, or at least the love of the moment, but it was also a place where you could celebrate. Pastor and politician Adam Clayton Powell Jr. married his second wife, singer and actress Hazel Scott, and they had their wedding reception at the Cafe Society uptown. They invited over 1,000 guests and fed them 5 types of salad and plenty of alcohol. So while the club was all of this for these couples, it'd be a place of escapism from the harsh reality of one famed Harlem Renaissance entertainer, Gladys Bentley. Now, before I tell you about Gladys Bentley's love story, I have to tell you about Gladys Bentley. So for those that don't know, she was a known entertainer during the Harlem Renaissance. She was a singer and a pianist for many clubs throughout her lifetime. And one in particular renamed their club to Gladys's Clam House after her. But Gladys was a truly unique performer. Author Jim Wilson wrote, quote, "She would take popular songs of the day and put the filthiest lyrics possible. She took the songs Sweet Alice Blue Gown and Georgia Brown and combined them, and it became a song about sex." So what all the rapper and singer girlies of today are doing is nothing new. But her performances would sometimes get the club shut down. Like for real shut down. Not like, okay, it's time to go home shut down, meaning no, we can't come back to this club, period. And of course, mostly this happened around the Prohibition. Now, Gladys would not only put her own lewd spin on songs, but she'd wear in, quote, an immaculate white full dress shirt with stiff collars, small bow ties, and skirts, Oxfords, short Eton jackets, and haircut straight back. So essentially, she was masculine presenting. She even called herself a, quote, male impersonator. During her performances, she'd sing directly to people in the audience, which many times would be filled with white women, which of course added another air of speculation about her. Because early in her career, Gladys was openly queer. Dr. Cookie Woolner wrote, quote, "Unlike many other popular Harlem artists at this time who hinted at their same-sex desires or acted on them but rarely discussed them, Bentley was always open about her love of women and went as far as to have a public wedding ceremony with her partner, a white female singer." Now, let me remind you that this was about a century ago. Being gay or queer then was initially seen as, quote, innocent practice for later marriage to men or merely as platonic friendships. And by the 1900s, it was viewed as, quote, a threat to heterosexual marriage and the family. And getting around to the Jim Crow period, quote, open homosexuality could only serve to harm the fight for racial equality in the struggle for full citizenship. Because even back then, a lot of civil rights activists felt like we could only focus on one thing. We couldn't simply suggest or request equality for everyone. So while Gladys bucked against society's norms, she did so while actually dealing with her own internal conflict. You see, Gladys grew up in Philly to a mother that never wanted a girl and a father she, quote, would even run away from. She said her mom, quote, refused to touch her when learning she gave birth to a daughter and continued to protest her parenthood by refusing to nurse her for 6 months. She wrote that she always knew that she was different. As a child, she felt comfort wearing her younger brother's clothes and developed her first crush on one of her elementary school teachers. Her parents forbade her from wearing boys' clothes, moved the family out of the neighborhood, and took her to many doctors to try to cure her from having these feelings. Decades later, she wrote, quote, "What my family did not know was that I didn't need a doctor, but love, affection, and healthy interest to supplant the malignant growth festering inside of me." Gladys felt like she was a deviant and eventually wanted to change that. After years of feeling unloved, flawed, and abandoned by her family, she struggled with her sexuality and even her own identity. She sought to fix herself by seeking medical help. Now, Gladys would try to do so by getting injections of, quote, female hormones 3 times a week for 6 months. And she did that because eventually she met a sailor named Don. Now, Don was a friend of a friend and would hit her up when he was in town on the weekends. Though she revolted at most men and particularly hated sailors because they represented, quote, the utmost aggressiveness in romance-minded men, she accepted his request to hang out with her one Sunday. And she actually grew to like him. She looked forward to seeing him and he made her feel comfortable. Quote, "He never brought up the subject of my love life, and every Saturday night he was right beside me on the piano bench at the after-hours spot where I worked." She wrote in an essay for Ebony magazine that he was interested in her and only her, and I guess let her know this. And so through time, she realized that, quote, "Don represented for the first time in my life pure, unselfish love, a miracle of love." But yet, she was still afraid. She wrote, quote, "Suppose I were to get married and my old habits were impossible to suppress. Eventually, I would lose him. I knew that if I married, I would have to make a clean break from my old life." Now that led her to get the hormone shots from the doctor and then accepted Don's proposal. She wrote that they were married briefly, but she would, quote, "always have a special feeling for Don because it was his loving tenderness which turned me back toward the path of normalcy and made it possible for me to share the kind of love and affection which the majority of people appreciate." Now, I failed to come across any other acknowledgement of this marriage or even this guy Don. Some historians even noted that Gladys was known to embellish and fictionalize parts of her life. But I do really hope it was true because I believe for the first time in her life, Gladys finally felt loved. Now, when she shared this essay to Ebony magazine in the August 1952 edition, it was under the sentiment of being, quote, a woman again. She said she wanted others to know, quote, that those of us who have taken the unusual paths to love are not hopeless, that we can find someone in the opposite sex who can teach us love as love really ought to exist. She also mentioned then she married an entertainment writer named J.T. Gibson. However, J.T. allegedly would deny their marriage, and by the time that article was printed, he actually had died at the age of 35 due to internal bleeding as he was parking his car. By September 1952, so about a month after the essay was published, it was reported that Gladys married a cook named Charles Roberts. Jet magazine reported that they, quote, were married at Santa Barbara, California, following a whirlwind courtship of 5 months. They honeymooned for 2 weeks in Mexico City. There are no other details about their marriage, but Gladys did pass away at the age of 52 from a virus infection as she was preparing to be an ordained minister. Now, if you can't tell, not all love stories are happy. Gladys Bentley shows us this. She had all this fame and fortune, but because she felt that she, quote, inhabited that half-shadow no man's land which exists between the boundaries of the two sexes, she was haunted. Her essay to Ebony was an attempt to show that she found contentment eventually through hormone therapy and the relationship to Don, but many that learned of her life story wondered if that was even truly the case. They speculate that the essay was her trying to prove and convince herself that she was fine and she was satisfied and she was happy. But through all the years of not feeling love, and probably the root of it starting in her household as a child, Gladys might not have ever gotten to that place of peace. But I truly would hope that she did. And that, Aisle Runners, concludes the love story of Gladys Bentley. Now, I know this was a different type of episode this week, but I do hope that you enjoyed it. Oh, and surprise, celebration, whoop, 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 whoop. We've hit over 4,000 subscribers on the two of you. Yes, yes, yes. So if you haven't done so yet, I highly suggest you do so. Appreciate you. Now come back next week for yet another Black History story of love. See you in the pews.